A final sense was the allegorical sense. And this is the one that in some ways is the most interesting, because this was a sense that the Reformers plainly rejected. In fact, they said that Scripture has only one sense, and the one sense that it has is the literal sense. But for them, they still understood the literal sense. They had an understanding that there were two literal senses. There was the historical grammatical, but there was, and that was important insofar as it helped to indicate what the actual history was. And for Luther, that also became important because in the early part of his career, he thought, well, some of those people, they were just kind of shadowy representatives of something, symbolic of something else. But as he matured, he came to understand that those people that were written about in the Old Testament were real people. They weren't just shadowy figures meant there for symbolic interpretation. They were real people who were intended to, who had the possibility of salvation. They struggled with the same kinds of issues, and the fact that they had that possibility of salvation was eye-opening for him. So it was, for him, the literal sense expanded. There was a double literal sense that many people through the Middle Ages had already identified, and he was simply living this out, carrying it out. But when he affirmed the literal sense, he was affirming both the historical and also this higher sense which had to do with Christ. How do these texts help us to understand what Christ is doing or has done for us? So that allegorical sense, it was allegorical because it was looking for Christ. It's the Christ meaning. In some ways, it's the theological sense. And if we're going to read Scripture as having a theological sense, we still have to largely employ allegory. But where Luther buried the term and kept the practice, we buried the term and the practice, so that in our own age, we tend to think that there is only one sense, and that the Reformers were only meant one sense, and they meant the historical grammatical. So we put nearly all of our faith in the historical critical interpretation of biblical texts that never does get to the theological meaning in most instances, and fundamentally, I would say, is inadequate on its own for preaching. It's essential. We have to build on it, but that doesn't take us into the pulpit.